So, Martin, a very warm welcome to the Culture de-cooded podcast. I've known you we were talking about it beforehand, for 15 plus years, I think, something like that. So I've been looking forward to this conversation. So a very warm welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
The main arc of this conversation, I'd like to follow the sheer variety of your professional career, which I know has taken in different industries, different ownership structures, different roles, but has always been marked by quite notable occurrences. So I think the challenge for us today is to limit it to an hour's conversation. That's probably the challenge that we both have. But maybe if you wouldn't mind just starting off for the benefit of the listeners, just to describe that arc of your professional roles over the last, what would it be, 20, 30 years or so?
Oh yeah, sadly I'm longer because I'm old. But yes, fundamentally I'd classify myself as someone that's worked in marketing, in packaged goods, that has got to general management positions, CEO positions, if you like, of divisions of companies. 15 years at PepsiCo was the most formative experience, which was brilliant. So that was working on the Walker's Crisp business primarily. Lots of good memories and learnings from that. I then moved out of corporate life and worked in a couple of private equity-backed situations. So the carve-out of Birdseye, Iglo from the Unilever business into a private company in 2006. And then in 2012, worked with another private equity-backed business, United Biscuits, which I did for 3 years until we sold it in 2014. Then I call it my delayed midlife crisis. I then moved into football administration.
Wasn't it your period of public service?
Well, you could see it that way. Yes, probably that'd be a nice way of putting it. I think both might be true. And I worked at the FA for nearly 5 years, from start of 15 to the end of 19. Brilliantly missing COVID. I'm not planning that, obviously, but it happened that way. And then I took on a number of part-time roles. So I'd been involved. I was a non-exec when I was at the FA of another private equity-backed business in food, with a joint venture with Nestle. But additionally, I took on a chairing of a charity called the Football Foundation, which I'd been a trustee when I was at the FA, which builds football pitches up and down the country, or gives grants for building football pitches. And then a small public company called Chapel Down, which is Britain's biggest wine producer, but Britain's not very big in wine production, so it's not a huge company, but it's growing pretty fast, and all the challenges and learnings of being involved in a listed business.
Recently listed?
Yes, well, yeah, actually, it had been listed before, but on a really tiny exchange, but only moved to a more grown-up exchange, AIM, in November last year, or December actually last year, so that was a good learning process. I've just more recently taken on another chair role in sport, in football, and I chair something called PGMOL, which is something that we need to work on for a name change, the Professional Match Officials Limited, which is the body that looks after elite refereeing.
Right.
And that appeals to me because of my football background, and there's an organisation that's dealing with technology change. Think about VAR. Higher expectations of what refereeing should do, how it should deliver its product in the most watched sport in the world. So that's an interesting one. I've just started that a few months ago.
Gosh, there's so much in that. And I know, and we'll dig into it a little bit, that, for instance, the period in the FA was quite an eventful period in terms of evolution of thinking around women's football, and both in terms of investment as well as in terms of positioning, allegations of bullying. So we'll dig into that a little bit. But I'd like to wind the clock back, because the 15 or so, you said 15 years in PepsiCo.
Yeah, just under, yeah.
One of the great academy companies. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like to work in, particularly in the younger GM years? Because I imagine that was very formative for you.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely loved the place. It was, and it seemed to like me, and you get that sort of often in a career. So it was deliberately meritocratic. So I'd worked for a couple of British companies before. I'm not saying they weren't, but I'd worked for Cadbury's back in the day. Then I'd worked for Mars, and Mars was a family kind of company, and that was more like it was meritocratic to a degree, but it was like a court. The family, the family with a king and kings and queens or whatever. PepsiCo was a very modern-looking meritocratic organization, which which really took merit seriously, and it didn't matter how you spoke, what you looked like, if you delivered results. That was the important thing, and most people got that. So it was a low politics, high delivery company, and yeah, I learned an awful lot there. I think so. I think I started my appreciation of culture there, which was built on in subsequent years.
Did they focus on it deliberately? Was it a focus for them, or was it very implicit?
It moved from being implicit to explicit. They were very strong. I think like GE were on leadership. When I was, been there a few years, that they were profiling what would predict good leaders. So I think a lot of work that I think GE would have been doing at the time,
probably
so kind of
parallel,
psychographically profiling, leadership types, and then realizing that there were lots of archetypes of a good leader. So how might they go and develop that? But it became more explicit as I was there. So for example, it's kind of one of my best or favorite anecdotes, well, two actually. So Roger Enrico was the CEO at the time. He was very, very good at trying to develop leadership behaviors. And just before I got my big break and was given the UK salty business to run, 98, I got invited to a leadership retreat in Wyoming, so in his ranch. And there were, a dozen of us from around the world. It was obviously quite competitive. And I remember we had, for the first thing we had to do is all bring our 360 feedbacks with us and talk about them. So we all did, and we all did it exactly the same way, which is, so I'm Martin, I'm good at analytical thinking, I'm good at decision making, I can communicate clearly, my development areas are X, Y, Z, and in the 2 minutes you spent 30 seconds on the strengths and 1.5 minutes on the where you've got to get improvements. And so we all did it, and Roger said, "This is classic. This happens every time." And he said, "I want you to understand that you need to be aware of your weaknesses, but build on your strengths." And then he picked on there's a guy, Terry, who was a sales director for Pepsi bottling in New York State. He said, "I love Terry." And he said, "Terry's just spent the last 2 minutes convincing me that he needs to get better at financial understanding." He said, "Terry, I'd never trust you to put a business proposal to a bottler. That's where you get a finance guy for, but you're brilliant at delivering it." And he said, we're all different. We all get into leadership in different ways. And it's about being aware of development areas and building on strengths. So that was a really good learning. And breath of fresh air to hear the CEO of the company say it. But the other Enrico thing, a few months later, I'm presenting to him. I'd got the UK job. And one of there are 3 set piece things in PepsiCo you have to do: the annual plan, the strategic 3-year plan, and then the people plan. And the people plan was really a good pipeline management, saying, okay, look at all your key people, who might be able to replace them in 2 years out, 3 years out, whatever else. And I was talking about one guy in particular in the marketing department, who I'd put down as a potential, in 3 years' time, they could do my job. And Roger had obviously known him a little bit, and he kept probing it, saying, "Are you sure? Tell me a bit more about him." And so he says, "Is there anything that what would give you sort of cause to hesitate this decision?" I said, "Well, I suppose, Roger, he's not great with people." He said, "Oh yeah, it's a bummer that, isn't it? Because last time I looked, that's the only species we employed." And it's such a great line. And yeah, and he'd obviously used it before, and it wasn't aggressive in any way. There was tittering around the room, so he'd obviously used it before. But that I thought, the importance of, seeing that you get results through people, not as by the way, there are people and you need to get results, was a big part of what they felt. And yeah, good learnings for me in 2 sort of very sort of personal ways.
As you say, a lot of parallels with GE at the time. For a long time, I've had a theory that organizations that really succeed in the long term are the ones that ultimately remove interference within an organization. And the main source of interference is people. So the likes of Pepsi and GE through the 90s and the noughties made that their primary lens for leadership. And I think as a result, it attracted people like you who found that you enjoyed the environment and it enjoyed you. And you created a very coherent, meritocratic, outcome-based organization. I think that's very interesting, because a lot of organizations who don't have a comparable focus on people in that way and leadership through that lens often end up with a lot of interference. and they end up hitting problems. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later in your other experience. So the shift, and I'm interested in your leadership journey as it goes through this, because the different environments that you worked in are really quite different in terms of the key currency that they operate on, but the ownership structures and the industries, et cetera. And so leadership, ultimately, your leadership journey would have evolved and you would have developed your own thinking, but also you would have had to adapt for those different situations. So the shift across from PepsiCo to the private equity environments, particularly not just private equity, but private equity ownership of a carve-out from Unilever, and that dynamic has its own factors. And what was that like, and how did you approach that, and what was your sort of adaptation of your leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good theme to pursue, because I think with hindsight actually, and the danger is with retrospection comes a narrative which probably didn't exist at the time. But
yeah, true.
I think all organizations or good organizations, or thriving organizations, have a few things in common, whether you're a charity, a sporting organization, a commercial business. And they're the things actually that you have to keep working on. And the context may be different, but the essentials about what makes for a good, healthy organization don't change. So you need a clear purpose. You need a strategy that people understand. You probably need a sense of urgency around why things need to get done. And obviously, they're different if you're selling potato chips versus if you're trying to encourage more participation in football. But it's still the same point. There's sort of people. I think people need a slightly bigger picture as to why they're working there, making them feel like they're doing something worthwhile. It sounds manipulative. It doesn't. Making them feel like telling them they usually are doing something worthwhile, and talking about the purpose and value of what they do, I think is really important. So where I got caught out, moving from PepsiCo into Birdseye, which was, as you said, it was the biggest carve-out, biggest private equity deal that had been done, I think, to date in food. They borrowed a lot of money to buy it. And they bought a business, guess what, that wasn't doing very well, which is why it's being sold. And the focus was very much on all of the hard measures very early on, right? How do you cut costs, things that Unilever should have done but didn't want to do, all those kind of things. And I felt early on that the thesis was there are people that worked in this company that have been Unilever lifers. The shock of moving from a kind of paternalistic Unilever environment.
Very consensus driven.
And by the way, in the case of Birdseye, one that hadn't ever talked about market share very clearly in my experience. So, not really close to the brutal truths of the marketplace. The thought was the shock of the ownership change would unlock a huge amount of urgency and energy. Now we're on our own, we need to go and get things done. And it really didn't. So I think where there is sort of fear and uncertainty, you get the same kind of behaviours clogging things up. And that there are lots of reasons why people weren't really engaging. They I think a lot of them felt that the company shouldn't have been sold. It was going to be a worse company by being part of a leveraged buyout than it would have been in Unilever. There were some people that kind of didn't understand really what was the problem. Why were things really bad? Was there really a burning platform here? So, it took me about 1.5 years to actually have the kind of time, but also the courage, and I'll talk about courage in a second, to talk to the investors saying we need to invest money in developing the culture of our business. And, the courage bit is I've been, and that's the context difference. I think in a sophisticated corporate, if you talk about culture, you will get listened to. I mean, so raising the subject won't raise eyebrows. You then got to talk about, make it sensible and practical. But in the world of private equity back in the day in 2006, they thought that was a degree of kind of HR gobbledygook, and was seen to be a diversion. The same happened, by the way, when I was at the FA. Talking to people about actually the team spirit, ironically, given that's a massive part of team sports, it's quite important to getting things done. So I was late on really tackling the culture journey at Birdseye, because I kept telling myself, well, we need to get this restructuring done first. We need to get the emergency work done. Then we'll get culture started off. And it was only really when I started to see two things happen. I was starting to just see no real improvement in ownership of decisions. So it still felt very much I was being the referee for too many things. But I promoted someone to head of HR, Tanya Howarth, who you know, who'd come in as IT separations expert. And she's a real, such a great caliber of an executive, and she had a lot more to give. And she took on the HR role. And there was then a sort of a mini coalition of people that might want to do things about culture and take it seriously and systematize it. And that's when I first met you. Yeah. When you were working with Sen Delaney.
Serendipity.
So I'd come across Sen Delaney when I was at PepsiCo. I'd never heard of culture consultants before then. And it was the only one I knew back in the day. And I thought they'd been pretty good. So hence the phone call. And we got going on really having sensible discussions with lots of people around the organization. That's kind of how it starts. A sort of sense of trying to get more of a common purpose. What are we trying to achieve? It's not about, and actually I got rid of someone, a very senior person in our team who wanted to talk to people in the business about how the equity plan was performing. Repetitively, yes. Which was also that was code for and how rich I'm going to become if you guys deliver it. I mean, it was so gauche, really. So there was no, people want the business to be successful, but the business needs an ambition and a point beyond any financial model that may exist in a private equities sort of company's business book. So it was all about saying, look, we happen to be owned by a private equity company. We're not going to be forever. We'll only thrive if we've got a business that's good for the next ownership and the ownership after that. But it was trying to bring that to life and the kind of behaviours that would work and wouldn't work, etc. So we took it seriously, and it started to, I think, bear fruit.
I remember it being a very evolving story. And if I come back to that courage word, my observation from your transition from PepsiCo to Iglo was in PepsiCo, the culture was there. You didn't have to consciously shape it. Yes, you needed to ultimately activate the people within your organization, but it was part of the furniture. And the same thing happens with people, for instance, in military organizations, where it surrounds you. When you leave and have to shape it yourself, it's actually a new skill set. And you've talked in the past about the difficulties of a CEO in ultimately seeking help on culture, because there's an unsaid assumption that you really should know how to do this yourself. But there's a courage aspect to that. So maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the courage to begin was even raising the subject, which is, hang on, we've got all these things to do. Why are you talking about this kind of stuff? It's sort of the challenge. But I think the acceptance of culture being an opportunity and a differentiator slowly has got better. So I think the challenge now is to more, can you make it speak sense? But there are kind of strange parallels with marketing and advertising. It used to be seen that the marketing department was the spending department. They weren't there to make money. Slightly frippish, people that would sort of design nice brochures and do good adverts, and the honest sons of toil in manufacturing and distribution would actually make the money that they could go and
do real
blow away.
Yes.
Yet clearly, the understanding that equity has a financial value, brand equity has a financial value. You can't judge every advertising investment by the short-term returns in sales, but you can look at it in other ways. So I think brand values probably got understood and then talked about in balance sheet ways before culture did.
Yes.
And then I think culture, because it's also an intangible, then seemed to follow. Now, I think the US has got the message quicker. So yes, it was. I think in just my personal journey, I did feel that I was in a minority of executives I came across that would, talk about culture and how it could be operationalized, and you need to get help for it. I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a CEO saying, got to do something about this stuff and delegate it to the HR department and then move on. So having it taken seriously I remember trying to schedule meetings amongst my senior team to do the work that was inherent in the Sendelaney work, the unfreezing, so basically time talking to one another and to build consensus about what needs to get changed. Even diarising it was difficult because everyone's saying, it's like, is it really that important? Yeah, actually it is. And that was the unpopular bit, giving up after, kind of like secretaries were going mad trying to lay things out. No, it's happening here, here. And if I've arranged any other meetings that I've said are immovable, call me and I'll make them I'll make them less immovable and we'll get it. So just starts with yourselves, getting people to see that as important and not a sort of distraction or I don't think anyone ever saw it as an ego trip. They just saw it as a slight, kind of irritation.
And irrelevance.
Not irrelevance, yeah, not core.
Yes. There's still a lot of that.
Yeah, so moving it from being, moving it into it's got to be core to who we are because actually this is how good businesses thrive and then deliver better results is useful. And I think one builds up, speaking personally, you build more confidence as you go along. So in my next move, Birdseye kind of didn't work out great for me really. I ended up getting fired by the private equity people because I disagreed with them about their exit and who they should sell to. It happens, right? It happens. And ironically, one of the private equity guys that was trying to buy Birdseye but were being rebuffed owned United Biscuits. And they said, we quite like what you've done at Birdseye. Can you help us here? Because we've been stuck a bit. And so I went in there with a bit more of a, probably I didn't know it was going to be a shorter term gig actually. And that certainly wasn't, the plan. But I went in there really much more clear about what were the key points of importance. And it was obviously a mix of, that there was clearly an opportunity on gross margin that they'd sort of let badly go, which is, I think, very fixable. But culture, once again, that there were all the traps of starting with all the senior managers who got equity, it made them, paradoxically, incredibly short term. So they were bringing in private label contracts because they felt that, that was going to be a way to sort of boost factory efficiencies, and it kind of really wasn't. And, it would be the bigger the private label percentage for a branded business like that would result in some discount to the exit multiple. But it was all, it was a very, very short term because it was believed that was what the private equity guys wanted.
Now, it was short term and it was also individualistic.
Very individualistic,
the pursuit of it.
So I remember when I took on and you remember it as well, so I took on the UB role and I called you.
Yes.
And you gave me a very good bit of advice early on to get me going before I started is, why don't you ask every shareholder and every one of the senior management on your team one question and compare it and contrast? And the question was, what is your ambition for United Biscuits? It's a really good question, simple question. I asked everybody it, and it ended up with the shareholders, the financial shareholders were much more ambitious, long-term. They're saying, we just want this business, got a lot of potential. We want it to do well. And we're kind of not that bothered whether it's 2 years, 3 years, we'd like, but there's a bigger picture here. And the management were much more, they'd say things like, well, success, the ambition for Birdseye, for United Biscuits is for Blackstone and PAI partners, who are the two owners, to get a good return on their investment. And they weren't bad people for saying it, but it was leading to totally the wrong things.
Yes.
So I guess that, I'd come into that after 6 years of, kind of slow start with kind of operationalizing culture, felt it had done good things at Birdseye. And I don't know whether it's because you then start to see it that you become a bit formulaic, but there's no harm in that, saying, well, this seems to be as important a part of driving the business as, cost efficiencies, this, that, and the other. So yeah, I got started earlier on it.
And the speed of the business transformation was remarkable.
It was remarkable. It surprised everyone, not least me. So we kept after sort of 6 years at Birdseye, where it was really hard. But frozen food, COVID was great for frozen food, but it was tough until then. Yeah, we got I think 1% top line growth a year, which actually wasn't bad for business, but it's not what we wanted. And in this business, there were just a few things to unlock quickly. I'm not going to bore you with the detail of it, but yes, it recovered really quickly. That gross margin focus and making everybody own that was really helpful. And so, yes, it's sort of to my slight surprise, I went in at the start of 2014 with my 5-year plan saying, look, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this. I mean, ran the business about 2.5 years, and they said, oh, yeah, I think it's doing really well. I think we're going to sell it. So, no, don't sell it.
Just getting started.
But they sort of know their business pretty well, and they put the business up for sale, and they made a fortune. So,
almost, you use the word unlocking, it almost felt like an unlocking, and it was a remarkable story to be part of. But it was gross margin, but it was also the alignment in the supply chain around focusing on service delivery, for instance. And just a simple improvement of service delivery from 95% to 98, 99%, not only meant that you were selling more, but it's with fewer empty shelves, but it meant that you leapt from, and I remember this is one of the things I like to talk about, you leapt from being in the bottom quartile of your retailer advantage survey when you started, to with 1 year you were in the top quartile, and then after 2 years you were the first.
Top, yeah. But
which is an extraordinary.
Well, it isn't. I mean, I think there was so much latent potential, but so one of your questions is how do you unlock it? And I think there are certain, once again, archetypes of group persuasion that work. And in the case of United Biscuits, it was restoring pride and saying, look, this business was, an absolute pioneer, and back in the day, it was driven by pioneers, Hector Lang and people that built the first factory in Harsden, that kind of thing.
And I should say for the listeners, this is McVitie's, Cars, Jacobs.
It's a very big global biscuit business. So biscuits are popular all over the world. But in the case of UK UB, it had been a public company. It got things badly wrong, got taken private. And so there's a sense of restoring pride. Look, this is, we're not going to throw away our legacy here. That there are things that we can do that should reinstill a sense of, holding your head up. Who do you work for, et cetera, as opposed to something that's been lost. And that was a common theme about restoring pride and with it self-confidence and a degree of chutzpah around what you went and did. And I think every organization's got, restoring pride is one archetype that can work for a lot. Breaking barriers is another one that can, so I think there are some general kind of human hardwired sort of concepts that can work for people. And that's where you can focus the communication message. So the reason for change at UB was, look, we've not made the most of what we've got, but we can quite easily.
So you were talking in terms of group persuasion techniques, and that's very interesting because there's a sort of marketing lens on that. I find that very interesting, and obviously it's informed by your background and your understanding of organization, but also what works in terms of group persuasion, in terms of marketing. I find that very interesting. You spent some time as president of the Marketing Association as well, which we didn't mention at the start. And one of your big themes, if I remember properly, was to promote the idea that marketing leaders can become more CEOs more frequently and more regularly. It'd be interesting if more of that happened in terms of understanding how group persuasion works. But can I talk about the FA? Because this, again, is another really interesting transition from my perspective. You go from 2 cycles of private equity businesses, with, particularly in the latter UB story, really quite rapid results. But I don't want to minimize the difficulty of the task, but the simplicity of the mission was quite clear into the FA, which, and I won't put words in your mouth. I'd love it if you unpacked it a little bit, but obviously the ownership structure is remarkably different. The purpose of the organization is more varied and perhaps less clear. And in the middle of a rapidly changing societal shift around behaviors, around equality. Women's football was a big part of your focus, as was competition football. So I'd love you to unpack all the learning that you've taken from Pepsi through your Iglo story in UB, and how did that then manifest in how you approach the FA job?
Yeah, the FA job is a paradox. And, if I was starting again, I wouldn't have changed many of the initiatives or many of the things I'd done. But, learning to work in a highly politicized environment was definitely the most personal challenging thing, just because I hadn't done it before. So I got into the FA a little bit by accident, but there had been some history. I'd been on the board of a football club, Leicester City, when I was at Walkers. I'd done a level 1 coaching badge, so I felt strongly about football. And I really felt that as an England fan, why were we so poor at tournaments? So kind of, I felt I was a frustrated England fan, and
unmet potential, similar to you being in some.
But there was an element of serendipity in everything. I happened to move next door to Greg Dyke, who about 6 months after I moved in became chairman of the FA, and we would talk football literally over the garden fence. He was a Brentford fan. I'd often go off and see Wolves. We would chat, and he said, "Look, we're going to do a CEO search because we need to make a lot of change." And Greg was a very good visionary guy. Actually, he knew what needed to happen, but hadn't really got a team that wanted to do it, or a board that wanted to do it. Even it was, it's difficult stuff. But he had some very clear points of view about what needed to be done, and persuaded me to apply. And I applied, and I got it. Now, I think I wouldn't have applied if I'd not known him. I think I would have thought that was probably in the too difficult to do box. But I went in relatively with my eyes open, and but driven by purpose. It was sense, look, purpose and learning. I'm going to learn a lot here. It may not always be fun. That was true. But I'm definitely going to learn a lot. And I think things can be done better. That's what I'm going to go and do. And so to bring it back to the kind of culture and leadership story, you put it very well, Charlie. Football in England, like everywhere around the world, is an industry. It's by far the biggest game. But you have professional leagues like the Premier League that run their competitions, and the FA does a number of things in that ecosystem. It does all the ugly work of governance, so it makes sure that laws are abided by or punished if not. That the game's clean, the big drug testing, drug management thing, anti-gambling. So kind of all of the
housekeeping.
Police. I think policing would be probably a good word, and that's once again that comes with a slightly different culture. It was there to promote participation. So encourage people to play football, train them properly, etc. It was responsible for the England teams. So if you got stopped on a tube and said, "What do you do?" Work for the FA, most people would say, "Ask about the England team." I meant England men's team, first off with. And it also ran a stadium, Wembley Stadium. Unusually, most FAs don't own a stadium. The FA did out of in 2000 when Wembley got rebuilt, the FA had to basically put its back behind it and get it rebuilt. So it owned a stadium. So that was also different. So you've got some quite different businesses all wrapped under one umbrella. So, bringing back to kind of culture and purpose, struck me the job early on that there wasn't any sense of guiding ambition about what the FA was there to do, specifically. What was it uniquely in charge of? Where it should delegate things to other parts of football, and what the point of it all was. Very early on, but with a lot of quizzical people in terms of the management team thinking, why are we having to spend time discussing this stuff? Because I kind of learnt by now the hard way. Kind of quite important early on. And so, and I had a couple of allies in that. There was a very good head of strategy who saw me as a sort of breath of fresh air, who'd done some really good work on, what the purpose of the FA might be, but we kind of really worked on that. So we talked about, in football, unite the game to inspire the nation. The FA can't do everything, but if it works with organisations that had previously been seen to be the mortal enemy, to wit the Premier League.
Yeah.
So the FA, if you stop most people in Richmond High Street, the FA is Dad's army. It's well-meaning, bit bumbling, going to get through. And the Premier League is like Genghis Khan. Rapacious, brilliant, unstoppable, juggernaut, all those kind of things. And it's pushed it. It's Britain's most successful, one of Britain's most successful exports. So Premier League sales of football matches dwarf the rest of the creative industries in Britain. So it's hugely popular. Anyway, so, but it was seen a bit, it was always seen to be a power game. The FA wanted this, the Premier League wanted that. So a lot of that was nonsense. You were arguing about things that didn't matter. And if you sort of agreed, let's try and make the most of what they do and what the FA does. And that was actually quite important for building consensus amongst the other footballing organisations, the Premier League and the Football League. Previously had really not wanted to work much with the FA because they just didn't understand each other. That was an innovation as well, to get that thing working and regular meetings. Right, who's doing what? How do we deal with various issues? But it was all about unite the game to inspire the nation was what the vision was, and then beneath it, the kind of the organisation imperative was to rebuild the FA as a world-class organisation, sporting organisation. So, that was what we came up with, and, the board actually quite liked it because, the watchword there was where it's collaboration. Collaboration will help us do things.
It's the glue, being the glue.
And knowing where we have to specialise. And then the challenge I got around the board was around the business imperative about rebuild the FA as a world-class sporting organisation. Half the board said, well, we've never been world-class. So I go, what do you mean?
So it was all about the
Yeah. So like, and then, so don't bother. We're not very good. I mean, it's quite extraordinary to half thinking, that's probably not a bad idea. And the watchword there was modernisation. So we're going to look and learn from other organisations from around the world and learn things from them. So it was about collaboration. It was about benchmarking and humility, taking in new ideas, not just from football, but from other sports. And just to kind of put that in context, a couple of times a week, I'd be asked by someone on the FA Council or someone that didn't like what I was doing, what do you know about football? And, I could have said, well, in the context of World Cups and Euros, what do you know about football? But it was this sense that unless you'd got your badges and had gone through the trenches, then you've got no right to, raise us money. That's the job of the FA. I should have mentioned that. Your job is to raise money and spend back in the game. That's another part of it. So big commercial organisations, sell TV rights, sponsorship. Raise money, but we'll figure out how to spend it. Thank you very much. So there's always that tension about how do you come into an organisation where you're not a football expert, and I never was, but a good understanding about where you might best deploy things and get the best out of football experts was sort of the challenge. So that was a journey. I think the kind of courageous things that if I look back at difficult decisions that I wouldn't have taken had I not been sort of playing around with understanding culture for years. There were two very clear anecdotes. Firstly, the firing of Sam Allardyce. So I inherited Roy Hodgson as a manager. And got into a bit of controversy early on because I didn't want to extend his contract till after the 16 Euros. Mm-hmm. And Roy is a real gentleman. He disagreed with me hugely, but he accepted it. And I'm glad I didn't. Glad we didn't, because we had a shocking Euros and we got kicked out by Iceland in the first knockout stage to create huge drama. And then as a result of that, the then acting chairman pretty much, drove a process to hire Sam Allardyce. In fairness to the chairman, he was the only man standing, really, if your criteria were he has to be English. And Sam's reputation as sort of he'd actually been pretty progressive in his management techniques and wanted to, he embraced the kind of model which was that any New England manager has to be based at St. George's Park. That's where the rest of the development teams are. And he bought into all that. But, got embroiled very early on in his career in a sting rather, by the Daily Telegraph, who basically got him oiled with alcohol and made him say things about how he could circumvent FA rules on dual ownership of players and, this, that, and the other. And it came out. And I decided, with a sort of more hesitant chairman, if I remember, so we've got to fire him. If it was you or me, Mr. Chairman, we'd be out. And he's the highest paid member of the Football Association. So he's the only England manager to be fired on the basis of behaviour as opposed to results. I'm pretty sure that's true. And that was a scary, lonely moment because, what do you know about football? You're bringing all this kind of corporate nonsense into the Football Association. Football's different. Kind of isn't, is it? And that was massively important because that also then allowed us to get what we wanted to do in the first process, get Gareth Southgate to interview because he'd got all the ticks, but didn't want to, was scared of the England job, I think, initially. And he took that job on. And as you know, the rest is history with him as a guy that really understands what culture can do and the rest. So that was an interesting one about, I wouldn't have done that had my cultural understanding been less well developed because the signal that sent everywhere was the right one.
The right one, but it's
albeit lonely.
But very scary.
Very scary,
right.
Yeah. Then the other one sort of was, once again, not getting too much into football, but there's what was the England team, men's team in particular, that they underperformed in tournaments. Individually, they were much better players than they ever looked like when they were playing together, and they were very brittle. So under pressure, thinking correctly under pressure, they didn't tend to do very well. And there were a whole litany of managers that hadn't really worked on that. So the expectations are huge always. That didn't help. So massively high expectations. They go into every tournament thinking, who's going to be the fall guy here? So it's all toxic. To me, if ever there was a cultural question, it was that one. So what does it mean when you put the England shirt on? Why does journalists have said the shirt weighs heavy on the player? So why is that? We say it's true, it is. Why? And we had a really good technical director, a guy called Dan Ashworth, who's continued to thrive in that world. And he had an idea of we had a meeting and said basically, okay, what can we learn from other sporting organisations? What's the best sporting organisation in the world? Well, the German national team at the time, or maybe it's Italy or France or whatever. And, he said, well, I think it's the All Blacks. It's rugby, and he waved the book around, leave things in a better place. And he was instrumental in getting a guy called Owen Eastwood, who was their head of psychology, the All Blacks head of psychology, to come and do some work at the Football Association, interviewing all of the teams, men and women's, really to unpack what is it? What does it mean to play for your country nowadays? Because, the old sort of strong, sort of patriotic, beat the badge on your chest thing, this generation didn't work. A lot of them were mixed heritage. You've got parents maybe come from different countries. And he did a very simple, really, but valuable bit of work about what the connection points could be. And it was revolutionary in the hands of a progressive manager like Southgate. So, okay, for a lot of these guys, they didn't want to be seen as spoiled. They all were, they're all millionaires, but actually what was important to them was industry, being seen to be role models. So trying hard, being seen to be role models in the communities from whence they came, and not wanting to be brats. That was important, and the antithesis of how the media would portray England players as kind of spoilt, don't care, whatever. And that was very powerful material. If you've seen the play Dear England, I would encourage any podcast listeners to. I think it's being made into a film actually, but that was brilliant. The way that story was told, it wasn't a documentary. Don't worry, but it got all the big calls right. And we hired a lady out of Australian rules football, a lady called Pippa Grange, who was able to kind of act along with Gareth and his team to sort of build on these things and make it a living thing. So there's the whole England team renaissance. And just to put it in perspective, since the Russia World Cup, which is first where this was put into place, we've started to perform in tournaments. We got to the semi-final of the World Cup in 2018. All the development teams are starting to win their age group World Cups. But men's senior team, which is what really people look at. The semi-final of the 2018 World Cup, finals of the Nations League, finals of the Euros. And we haven't had that level of performance for years. And we go into tournaments now, we England, looking like we're contenders. And football's so competitive, you're never going to guarantee, with respect, I'm not going to diss rugby, but rugby, you kind of know there's 2 or 3 teams that are going to win it. There's probably about 10 in football, in tournaments. But going in as sort of one of the favourites and performing, that's been a result of a number of things, but culture change being a key to unlocking it.
If we listening to you tell that story, I remember talking to you at the time. You brought a real focus to the purpose of the organization to be the real outcome, the real results that we can demonstrate is performance in tournaments. And you brought a real organizational focus to it and a deliberate focus. That's been characteristic, I think, of your leadership roles throughout at least the time I've known you and probably further back, is that you really spend time identifying what really matters and giving it a disproportionate focus. And that's, given the complexity of organizations, it might be a really simple thing to say, but it's not that common, actually. And I think a lot of organizations struggle to create that real clarity of purpose. You brushed over the development teams piece, and we haven't talked about the women's team either. But your focus on tournament performance or tournament football ultimately first started to show its results in the development team.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
And of course, what's happening now is that they're now all coming through into the senior team, and you're creating this engine of tournament football. So could you talk a little bit about that? Because it was, I think if I'm right, under 20s, under 17s were successful in World Cups.
Yeah.
And obviously the Lionesses have been incredibly successful. Talk a little bit about that, sort of seeing that's over not just the men's senior team, but the overarching tournament performance and St. George's Park and what role that plays in it.
Yeah, okay. And that's helpful reminding me in terms of kind of, I call that more strategy, but once again, learning the hard way. And I think unless you apply overwhelming force on a few things, you probably don't make the progress that you need. And I think one of the problems that, managers have in any organization is that there's lots of things. Yeah. It's the classic, important, not important, urgent, non-urgent, and you get sucked into the kind of, urgent, not important box. So yeah, to me, once again, the Clapham Omnibus test was, if you worked at the FA, people wouldn't really ask you about, well, how much money are you raising? How's your governance process? It's, are we ever going to win a tournament anytime soon? So, it was massively important for the way that the organisation felt, the encouragement of participation. I think I'll talk about the women's in a second. That tournament success has been really important for that. So it was about organising it differently. And we had, before my time, we'd had the foresight to steal from the French an idea of a national development centre. So the French had been sort of 10 years ahead of us in developing a place where talented kids could go and play, get experience, play together, and then go back to their clubs. Called St. George's Park in the Midlands. Great setup. But when I went there, it hadn't been properly funded because they'd sort of been running out of money or couldn't make the budget changes otherwise.
It hadn't been a focus.
It wasn't a focus. And one of the horrible things I had to do early on to basically deliver what Greg Dyke, the chairman's sort of hopes were, was in a non-for-profit organisation, fire 120 people. So we did a massive restructure where we said, and we're not, so it's non-for-profit, you're not there to make more profit. You're there to say, I make this surplus and I choose to put it in these ways. We want to put a lot more into the St. George's Park project by way of, more development teams, more experts, more backroom experts, all those things, all those posts that hadn't been filled. And to do it, we had to then make cuts elsewhere in the organisation, which were in the scheme of, ruthless prioritisation, a bit less important. But it was hard to do because people didn't work at the FA to get rich. They worked because they had a strong sense of purpose. They felt they were doing good things. And, that was, that's a hard thing to explain. We're doing good things, but we need to focus more on this area. And, it was difficult. That created great sort of disquiet amongst board members who sort of signed up to the program. And then when they found that Fred was going and Jim, I thought, you can't do that. So but it was really important to do. And that was, I call that more of a strategic sort of hardball decision. And then, yes, it was, and it's definitely sort of done the right thing. And that also, that along with a more creative way of selling TV rights allowed us to put a lot more money into the women's game. So that was a classic one as well of the big, hairy, audacious goal. Actually, women's football, my first World Cup I went to was the Women's World Cup in 2015 in Canada. We went out there as sort of no-hopers, and we made the semi-final. And they were just such a strong team, physically strong. They didn't play particularly attractive football, but their personalities were all strong. First time we'd taken out psychological support to a team, and that sort of worked. So they outperformed, came back, everyone's feeling really happy, because women's sport was growing, or women's football rather was growing. And, I did the thing once again, learning my bitter experience. I wanted to get all the people involved in women's football to a meeting, and I want to talk about where we're going to go with it. Well, I'm busy. And of course,
didn't seem to have any
there's
momentum.
No agenda. And I said, there is an agenda. It's just one point of the agenda, which is where are we going to be by 2020? And it was then I forced this. I came up with the number. It's double participation in women's football, and double the number of players then getting through from grassroots football into professional clubs. And that was the kind of audacious goal, which really changed the way we had to think and get a new person in to lead it, because women's football was much more like Olympic sport than it was boys football. A talented boy gets picked up by a club and goes into their academy system age 8, but that wasn't true for women. So you had to treat it more like an Olympic sport, development centres around the world, around the country. And that's when we got in so where do we go to hire? Sue Campbell, who'd been in charge of the British 2012 Olympic teams development, where we did so well. It was the one sport she never got really heavily involved in because they wouldn't let her in was football. And she created great things.
That's remarkable. And women's football, clearly over the last, since 2015, you say there was the Canada World Cup, over the last 10 years or so, is now accelerating in terms of participation, in terms of performance, and really captured not only the nation's imagination, but seemingly pulled a lot of new people into football sport. And I understand the sort of audiences they're getting at Arsenal and Chelsea actually are not the same audiences watching the women's games as they are the men's games. That's been the big insight. So, and I know a lot of this started in the events that you're talking about in terms of investment and making it a priority. Maybe some reflections on that, but also some of the barriers you need to overcome in your existing organisation, because that was a big mentality shift.
Yeah, it was, and the FA wasn't misogynistic in any way. It wanted women's football to develop, but wanting something isn't the same as getting it done. And the barriers to it was that actually in women's football there was no seat at the funding table. So the way it's Football Association, there was an article of the association that said every pound that the executive raised, 50 pence had to go to the grassroots game and 50% to the professional game. Why did the professional game need anything?
Yeah.
But that was because they're shareholders, and actually within it, with the cooperation of the Premier League in particular, we were able to redefine some of the spending, so we could sort of say, particularly developing the women's professional game. But the barriers, the barriers were just more practical. But if you talk about measures, one of the key measures, if you're a participation organisation that you have, is participation numbers. The men's game was mature, and you could see data as, particularly with men's football, 20 to 30 amateur football was sort of declining a bit as lifestyles changed. Participation was good, but actually the massive growth, think about if you were being bonused in a commercial organisation on numbers, the women's game's easy.
There's the growth market.
Everyone wants to play, kind of like help them play it. So it was, I think, once again, you talk about what are the key measures. Participation was a key measure. So if we're kind of excited by participation, this was clearly a good thing to go and do. But it was, it was difficult because the infrastructure wasn't there in the same way. There were fewer girls' teams, so so you had to create things. So the barriers, I think, were more sort of slightly statecraft, which is finding the money, and at times not being explicit about where that money is coming from. Then it's, the classic case of, what's if you see that as a change project, if you take Cotter's 7-stage of change, creating quick wins, so important. So important.
Visible quick wins.
Visible. Oh, right. Wow, I can see this. We got, lot more people participating. That puts them pressure on. We need to get some more women referees. Oh, and the international tournaments are way more important for the development of the women's game than they are for men's.
That was because you've got the Premier League. That's the visibility side.
So, that continued to naturally develop because there were more talented athletes coming through. But once again, it had the same level of focus that the men's team had in terms of what St. George's Park could give them through strength and conditioning, all those other things, tournament resilience. And, performance improved, semi-finals we got to, and then they won the Euros last year or 2 years ago, final of the World Cup this year, lost to a better team, but still a final of the World Cup.
Yeah.
And once again, they always look like their competitors. And the thing that sort of, as a bit of a football nerd, one of the stats I love about the women's game, in the Canada World Cup, our pass completion ratio is about 50%. With respect, we're a bit like Stoke City. We're a strong team that were hard to beat, but didn't use the ball very well.
Yeah.
When we won the Euros, we had the most pass accuracy in the opposition's half out of anybody in that tournament.
Through the whole tournament?
Through the whole tournament. So we're just developing more gifted, well, not more gifted, but more technically adroit players.
Yes.
But you've got to keep going because Spain, who won the World Cup, were nowhere really 4 years ago, and they've invested in it. So it's competitive. I think people's expectations about what it should look like as a game are naturally changing positively as well. So
moving very quickly, isn't it? Fascinating. I think we can talk for hours about the evolution of football because there's so much going on, not just from a sporting and effectiveness perspective, but also reflecting society.
Really
and so there's lots of that. But let's move on because you're now in what's usually termed a plural career. So you talked about Chapel Down. You've got a couple of non-executive director roles, also chairman of both the Football Foundation and the, I'll paraphrase, but the Referees Association.
Excellent, yeah.
So again, that's another shift from executive to non-executive. Love to hear a few reflections of what you've seen and not only from your own perspective, from a leadership perspective, but also the role boards or supervisory bodies play in shaping and defining culture, because it's a real area of interest. And I think talk about a growth industry, I think that's quite early on, and I think, or at least it's very heterogeneous at the moment.
Yeah, I think the role that boards play in culture is very important. I think you're right, it's evolving. I think boards struggle with things that are intangible. So, but in the same way, I used that marketing or advertising analogy earlier on in the chat. I think there's a recognition amongst sophisticated boards that, what's the people asset doing? How is it feeling? So I think I see more of that. Although from a practical level, I find it quite hard. So a couple of boards I've been involved in where I chair it, I can be more sort of prompting. I do think you need to sort of understand the role of CEO and chair, non-exec chair in this. So I think it's getting more of a debate. And then I think one of your themes, Charlie, comes out, and I use it to make it sound like I'm wise, is because there's a default to measurement, engagement is measured or quite a lot, and that is seen to be the culture box ticked.
An adequate substitute.
Yeah.
Yes.
So actually, it's good that engagement's being tracked, although I do find I've not seen any organisation yet where it's bad. Yeah, they always have a couple of orange boxes where it could be better. So I kind of
where it's moving very much, which is the
I can't imagine it's that discriminating, but at least that's sort of being there. So I guess one of my next sort of challenges is how do you create the case? And it's much more of a persuasive thing now, particularly with the CEO, I think, to say, okay, how might you really take this stuff seriously? And your point earlier on about how do you adapt it for different circumstances is really good because you sort of have to. So I'm on the board of a company called Frenary, which you know a little bit, but it's a $6 billion euro business, second biggest ice cream company in the world, a joint venture with Nestle and PAI Partners. And it's really interesting that the roots of it were Nestle pulled a lot of their assets into this new company, wasn't Nestle anymore, and their factories started to do better. Nestle executives who were seen to be not very good started to thrive. What was that about? So in terms of culture at work, but it's an organization that doesn't like to be explicit about it. But one of the more interesting conversations we've had recently is saying, well, actually, you know what, we ought to just describe what this is, because it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And just because it's not got a playbook written to it doesn't mean it's not culture. And they've actually done a very good job, I think, of saying, okay, well, the essence of what we do, and when the CEO goes at some point in the future, next person coming in, there is actually an implicit playbook. You know the kind of things that are important. But if you just for tangible examples of seeing hard results from differently managed and differently wired organizations, that's a great one to see. So kind of, I guess I've been pushing that one a bit, saying, well, let's codify it. Let's try and get a bit more disciplined about it.
There is an instinctive, as I experience it, reluctance to codify, which I'm not sure is founded in good judgment or just instinctive reaction. Because obviously, if you have something, Froneri is a good example. The CEO has been instrumental in creating that. But if an organization is to continue surviving and not rely on individual people, there is a need to codify. But the implicit reluctance to codify might imply that if you codify, it doesn't have the magic that it had before. So there's a real tension in that. The encouragement that I give a lot of organizations to is to think about culture on the same terms as you do to financial metrics, for instance, is that actually you should be using equal and equivalent frameworks to measure and track progress. Now, arguably, financial metrics are output measures, they're lagging indicators, and culture is an input measure. But there's a big mentality shift required to actually see it in that framing. And I think often, and I'm seeing this increasingly, although still quite early stages, that shift in mentality is starting at the board. The conversations at the board, which usually include the CEO and CFO at a minimum, they're starting to happen at a board. How do we actually become more rigorous about this? Starting in regulated industries, because the regulator wants to see that. But that understanding and that conversations are starting to happen at boards. And a lot of executive teams are actually coming out of board meetings going, actually, we need to do something different, or we need to evolve our approach from engagement to include more practical, tangible measures.
I think you make a good point. I think where it will start is in more regulated industries, because you can say there's a burning platform here.
And regulators want to see the evidence.
Our people are going to get us into trouble. And they're not wanting to, but there are certain behaviours that have been hardwired for years. I imagine money laundering in banks would be one of them.
Yeah.
That we just have to address. So, but it will, and the tool actually to get the culture discussion in those kind of organisations is the risk register. Every good board's got one.
Yep.
So you kind of start off by saying, kind of where does culture fit in that? Because you can then get, if it's flashing red, or if you see the problems as maybe human problems, then you can get into doing it. So yeah, I think I'm very confident it will. I mean, the industry is still pretty immature, but it will evolve, because at least now there's a general understanding about what culture is, and there's greater awareness that it can be operationalized, an ugly word I've used before, but I think it's quite good, as opposed to, yes, we'd like to do something about it, but you know what, actually there are some techniques that are proven that work.
Yeah.
That could be done in loads of organizations of different types. But like anything, nothing comes for free, and you have to invest behind it. See it as a journey, say apply the same disciplines to it, as you mentioned, to say financial investments and the like. So I think I'm very confident it will continue to evolve as a professional service.
And the more examples of where it's made a difference, and gosh, we've touched on more than half a dozen on this talk, the more that reinforces that story, and the more I think it's really just about stories and evidence. And that's a great point at which to draw this to a close. I had in mind that we were going to talk separately about leadership and culture, but we didn't. And that shouldn't surprise me, because they're integrally linked. But I really appreciate you sharing your insights, the learnings from a really remarkably varied leadership career. And there's been a lot behind it that we haven't talked about. Finally, a question we're asking each of our podcast guests is, given that journey and your own personal perspectives and standpoint, if you were to encapsulate your leadership journey in a song, what would that song be?
Oh yeah, okay, so I'm going to give you an oblique one.
Okay, that's good.
It's It's by the Byrds, but it's written by Bob Dylan. It's called My Back Pages. And the refrain is, "Oh, but I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now." And what it's about is the certainties that you have, you've got to keep questioning. And you know, the things that you thought were sure before, perhaps be a little less sure about them, stay curious. So I think, as I think about it, it's a really hard area, culture, and I don't think I've remotely got it done, other than I'm keen to explore it. And I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now, is just tells you, stay humble, keep learning, prepared to be surprised. And it's a great tune.
A very Socratic. The more I know, the less I believe I know. Martin, that's wonderful. Thank you. We'll add that to our playlist.
Okay.
Which we are developing.
It's a belter. It's a belter, I can promise you.
Really appreciate you taking time. Thanks so much.
Welcome. Thank you.